In the bustling marine metropolis of SeaWorld San Diego, a unique relationship was quietly blossoming. It wasn't between thrill-seeking tourists and playful dolphins, but between a seasoned professional and a formidable apex predator, Ken Peters. A veteran orca trainer, and Kasatka, a powerful matriarch by the year 2000. Ken Peters was a fixture at Shamu Stadium. He wasn't just going through the motions. He had dedicated years to understanding the intricate behaviors of orcas, their subtle cues, and the delicate balance required to work alongside them. His colleagues admired his calm demeanor, his meticulous approach, and his genuine respect for these intelligent creatures. Peters wasn't a showman. He was a student, forever learning and adapting. This was how he earned trust, and trust was paramount, especially when dealing with an orca like Kasatka. Kasatka's story began far from the sun-drenched shores of Southern California. In 1978, she was captured off the coast of Iceland, a traumatic event that forever altered the course of her life. At just 2 years old, she was ripped from her family, her pod, her ocean home. She had been in captivity for over 2 decades. By the time she encountered Ken Peters, life in captivity is a world away from the lives of wild orcas. In the wild, they roam vast territories, diving hundreds of feet deep. These highly intelligent mammals live in stable family groups, communicating through complex vocalizations and sharing knowledge passed down through generations. In the confines of an enclosure, even a large one, these instincts are suppressed. Kasatka, however, remained a force to be reckoned with. Even within the artificial social structures of SeaWorld, she exerted a natural dominance. She was intelligent, quick to learn, and fiercely protective, especially of her offspring. These traits made her a star performer, but they also demanded respect and unwavering focus from her trainers. At SeaWorld San Diego, Ken Peters developed a special bond with Kasatka. Their collaboration was a daily masterclass in patience and understanding. They spent countless hours together, building rapport through training sessions, feeding rituals, and shared performances. Their performances together were a visual spectacle, a carefully choreographed dance between man and whale. Ken would swim alongside her with seemingly effortless grace. He would guide her through leaps and dives, relying on subtle hand signals and vocal cues. He would even ride on her back, a demonstration of trust that captivated audiences. Behind the scenes, their relationship was more nuanced. Ken studied Kasatka's every move, learning to anticipate her moods and recognize her individual preferences. He knew when she was feeling playful, when she was feeling restless, and when she needed space. He understood that trust wasn't a given. It had to be earned and constantly reinforced in carefully staged moments during rehearsals. The two seemed to share an affection. There were images of Ken face to face with Kasatka, as if they were locked in a tender gaze. This was the illusion that SeaWorld sought to create, harmony and friendship. But this carefully constructed image concealed a darker reality. Kasatka, despite her years in captivity and her apparent bond with Ken Peters, was still a wild animal, and her history at SeaWorld San Diego hinted at a deeply troubled past. Beyond the captivating shows and the seemingly idyllic interactions, warning signs lurked. Records, often tucked away and downplayed, told a different story about Kasatka's temperament. Even before Ken Peters became her primary trainer, Kasatka had demonstrated unpredictable and, at times, aggressive behavior. In 1993, years before the events of November 2006, she reportedly lunged at a female trainer, knocking her into the water. This incident, while documented, was largely dismissed as an isolated event. There were other, less dramatic, but equally concerning incidents. Trainers noted that Kasatka could be possessive of certain areas of the pool, refusing to allow other whales or even trainers to enter. She would sometimes ignore commands, seemingly testing the boundaries of her control. These were subtle signs, but they indicated an underlying tension, a persistent struggle for dominance. One internal behavior log, which would later surface during legal proceedings, described Kasatka as easily agitated when separated from her calf. The log specifically warned trainers to exercise caution when working with her under stress. This was a crucial piece of information, highlighting the potential for heightened aggression when Kasatka's maternal instincts were triggered. SeaWorld acknowledged these issues, at least internally. Staff training manuals emphasized the need for heightened awareness when working with Kasatka. Trainers were instructed to be extra vigilant, to anticipate her moods, and to avoid any actions that could be perceived as threatening or confrontational. A former trainer would later testify during OSHA hearings that Kasatka was notorious for testing boundaries. Another stated that she would often comply with commands, but only on her own terms. These statements painted a picture of an animal constantly pushing back against the constraints of captivity, challenging the authority of her handlers. Despite these red flags, Kasatka remained a star attraction, a valuable asset to SeaWorld's entertainment empire. Her performances were flawless, her interactions with trainers seemingly seamless, and for someone like Ken Peters, who had earned her trust and respect, the risks felt manageable. He believed he understood her. He thought he could control her, but the illusion of control is a dangerous thing, especially when dealing with a creature as powerful and unpredictable as an orca. The combination of Kasatka's inherent wildness, her documented history of aggression, and the inherent stresses of captivity created a volatile mix. It was a disaster waiting to happen. And on a seemingly ordinary afternoon in November 2006, that disaster would finally erupt, shattering the illusion of harmony and forever changing the lives of Ken Peters and Kasatka for years. Ken Peters entered the water with Kasatka, placing his trust and life in her massive jaws. November 29, 2006 would change everything. It was Wednesday, November 29, 2006. The air in San Diego held that crisp pre-winter chill. But inside Shamu Stadium, the atmosphere was anything but cool. Thousands of spectators, families mostly, buzzed with anticipation. The familiar, pulsing music started, building to a crescendo. The Believe show, a SeaWorld staple, was about to begin. Standing poolside, wetsuit gleaming under the bright lights, was Ken Peters, a seasoned trainer, a veteran. This wasn't his first rodeo. He knew the drill, knew the cues, knew the animals. Across the vast pool, a dark silhouette breached the surface. Kasatka, over 5,000 pounds of raw power, grace and intelligence rolled into one magnificent orca. The Believe show was a spectacle built on the illusion of connection, of mutual respect, of a bond between humans and these apex predators. The music swelled, the crowd roared, and Ken, with a practiced smile, plunged into the shimmering blue water. He swam alongside Kasatka, their movements almost mirroring each other. A perfect, synchronized dance. Then, the signature move, Kasatka, with seemingly effortless power, lifted Ken onto her back. Together, they plunged into a graceful dive, sending a wave of water cascading over the audience. Magic, But behind the smiles, behind the carefully choreographed routines, something was amiss. Unseen by the cheering crowd, a subtle shift in Cassandra's demeanor, a slight hesitation in her movements. Her calf Kalia vocalized from a nearby holding pool. Her calls were sharp, insistent. Maybe it was the noise, maybe it was some internal instinct, but something had changed. The maternal switch had flipped, and then, as Ken floated beside her, waiting for the next cue, Kasatka began to sink. Slowly, deliberately, Ken adjusted, instinctively moving with her. But this wasn't part of the show. This was something else, entirely, before he could react, before he could signal. Before he could even fully process what was happening, Kasatka lunged. With terrifying speed and force, her massive jaws clamped down on Ken's left foot, and she pulled him under. The music screeched to a halt. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Below the surface, the controlled, rehearsed world of the Believe show dissolved into chaos. The water erupted in white foam as Kasatka dove deeper, dragging Ken with her. Her grip was firm, a crushing pressure around his left foot. Not enough to break bone, but enough to inflict serious lacerations. Enough to send a clear message. She was in control. Plunged into the frigid depths, visibility vanished. Ken was swallowed by the cold, silent world beneath the surface. He couldn't fight. Her, not directly. To resist with force would risk an even more catastrophic response. Instead, he had to rely on years of experience, on intuition, on the hope that he could somehow regain control. He had to stay calm. Kasatka resurfaced after what felt like an eternity, just long enough for Ken to gasp for a precious breath of air. The crowd, initially unsure if this was still part of the act, started to murmur nervously, but the momentary reprieve was short-lived. Without warning, she plunged again, this time faster, deeper. Ken's body thrashed behind her, helpless, dragged, like a rag doll in the current of her immense power. At the pool's edge, backup trainers scrambled into action. Panic etched across their faces. They knew this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't defiance. This was a full-blown attack. Full-blown attack. Emergency procedures kicked in. Nets, poles, hoses, anything that might distract Kasatka, anything that might break her hold. Trainers slapped the water's surface, desperately trying to regain her attention, but nothing worked. Kasatka surfaced, again, for just a fleeting moment. Ken's hand, nearly limp, broke the waterline, a desperate signal that he was still conscious. Then, another plunge, even longer than the last. Underwater logs, later revealed during legal proceedings, documented that she held him down repeatedly for intervals approaching 60 seconds or more. Between each forced descent, Ken managed only seconds to breathe. The audience was no longer confused. The nervous chatter had turned to cries of fear. Children sobbed, clinging to their parents. Gasps echoed through the stands. Someone screamed. Trainers barked orders into radios, activating the full emergency response protocol. But still, no one entered the water. The unwritten rule: never directly intervene. This was Ken's fight alone. Kasatka circled again, tightening her grip, dragging him by the foot around the pool like a macabre trophy. She refused to release him. His lungs burned, his ears rang. The cold chlorinated water seeped into his wetsuit. Each second below the surface was a desperate battle against instinct, a desperate plea for oxygen. And Kasatka wasn't done. From the stands, the dazzling display of harmony had transformed into a slow-motion nightmare. The longer Kasatka kept Ken underwater, the more frantic the trainers became, the more horrifying the reality sunk in. This wasn't part of the show. Parents stood frozen, shielding their children's eyes. Witnesses later recounted the chaos, the deafening sound of slapping water, the piercing whistles, the palpable fear that hung in the air. Below the surface, Ken Peters was fighting for his life, second by agonizing second. Each time Kasatka surfaced, she granted him just enough air to stay alive, only to seize him again and drag him back into the depths, treating him like prey. But even as she pulled him down, even as she twisted him through the water, even as she pinned him near the bottom, Ken never lashed out. He didn't scream, he didn't kick, he didn't panic. Instead, he focused, communicating with subtle hand. Signals, deliberate motions, relaying to the surface that he was alive, aware, and desperately trying to maintain control. Emergency personnel on deck focused intently on his hands, his only means of communication. The trainers continued their desperate attempts to intervene, waving towels, tossing life rings, calling Kasatka's name. But nothing penetrated her focus. She was locked in, circling and diving with the man she had once performed beside. Inside the crowd, the horrifying truth began to sink in. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a miscue. It was an attack. I just kept thinking, how long can he hold his breath? One guest later told reporters. It didn't feel like minutes. It felt like forever. Still, Ken held on. He remained calm, knowing any sudden move could escalate the situation. He understood what few others in that stadium fully grasped. If he panicked, he was dead. And Kasatka wasn't finished yet. What came next was even more terrifying. 9 minutes and 47 seconds. That's how long Kasatka held Ken Peters captive. Nearly 10 agonizing minutes of dragging, dunking, and circling. 10 minutes of forced submersions, fractured breaths, and a crowd frozen in helpless disbelief. Then, without warning, the rhythm changed. Kasatka surfaced one final time, but instead of plunging back down, she paused, her massive body hovering in the center of the pool, just feet from the glass. Ken floated beside her, motionless, his body limp with exhaustion. She had stopped pulling, for the first time since the attack began. She let go. Ken didn't flinch. He waited, unsure if it was a trap, unsure if any sudden movement might trigger another violent surge. Seconds ticked by, then, slowly, deliberately, he began to swim. His strokes were weak, uneven. Blood trailed from his foot, mixing into the chlorinated water like smoke. Each kick sent waves of pain through his leg, but he didn't stop. He didn't look back. He focused on the pool's edge, on the shallow platform that represented safety. The distance was only a few feet, but it felt like miles. Trainers on deck crouched low, arms outstretched, calling his name. One of them, armed with a long pole, kept it trained on Kasatka's head, ready to intervene if she lunged again, but she didn't. She watched in silence as her former partner crawled, half submerged, toward the wall. When Ken finally reached the platform, hands clawing for the ledge, 2 trainers grabbed his arms and yanked him from the water in one swift motion. His foot was mangled, ripped open in multiple places. Deep gashes exposed raw tissue. His wetsuit was shredded and soaked in blood. His face was pale, his eyes wide, but he was alive. He had survived an attack by a 5,000-pound predator. Emergency responders rushed to his side as he collapsed onto the concrete. He was conscious, breathing, alive. He had survived, but the attack would leave scars far deeper than skin. Because what the world didn't yet know What SeaWorld would be forced to confront in the years ahead was that this wasn't just a close call, it was a warning. And it wouldn't be the last. The $75,000 fine levied against SeaWorld by OSHA might seem like a relatively small sum for a multi-billion-dollar corporation, but the dollar amount itself was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the precedent it set, the admissions it forced, and the permanent change it wrought on how SeaWorld, and indeed the entire marine park industry, operated. The findings of Judge Ken S. Welsh were scathing. SeaWorld, he declared, had willfully exposed its trainers to a known hazard waterwork with killer whales, a hazard that was likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Let that sink in for a moment. Willfully. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. According to the federal government, SeaWorld knew the risks, understood the dangers, and yet continued to put its trainers in harm's way. The evidence presented by OSHA painted a disturbing picture of a company prioritizing profit and performance over the safety and well-being of its employees. The history of Casata, her documented aggression, and the internal warnings issued to trainers became irrefutable proof that SeaWorld was aware of the potential for disaster. The attack on Ken Peters was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a systemic problem. The ruling had two immediate and profound consequences. First, it effectively banned waterwork between trainers and orcas without physical barriers. No more riding on their backs, no more swimming alongside them, no more intimate interactions that had defined SeaWorld's performances for decades. The era of trainers and orcas seamlessly intertwined in the water was over. At least in the United States. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental disruption to SeaWorld's business model. The spectacle of trainers performing seemingly impossible feats with these massive marine mammals was the park's main draw, the source of its iconic imagery and the foundation of its global brand. To take away that element was to remove the heart of the SeaWorld experience. The second consequence was more subtle, but perhaps even more far-reaching. The OSHA ruling emboldened critics, fueled the growing anti-captivity movement, and opened the floodgates to a wave of scrutiny and public backlash that SeaWorld had never before experienced. The attack on Ken Peters, once a closely guarded secret, was now a widely publicized symbol of the inherent dangers of keeping orcas in captivity. The video of the attack, released as part of the OSHA investigation, became a viral sensation, horrifying. Viewers around the world, the sight of Ken Peters being dragged beneath the water repeatedly for nearly 10 minutes, shattered the illusion of a harmonious relationship between humans and orcas. It revealed the raw power of these animals, their unpredictable nature, and the inherent risk of confining them to small artificial environments. The years following the OSHA ruling were tumultuous for SeaWorld. Attendance declined, revenues plummeted, and the company's stock price took a nosedive. Pressure mounted from animal rights groups, former trainers, and the public to end the captive orca program altogether. The release of the documentary, Blackfish, in 2013, proved to be a watershed moment. The film, which featured interviews with former SeaWorld trainers and explored the psychological and physiological effects of captivity on orcas, ignited a firestorm of controversy. Blackfish directly implicated SeaWorld in the death of trainer Don Broncho, who was killed by the orca Tilikum in 2010, and argued that captivity was a major contributing factor to the animal's aggression. The film was a public relations disaster for SeaWorld. It triggered boycotts, protests, and a widespread re-evaluation of the ethics of keeping orcas in captivity. Celebrities publicly denounced SeaWorld, schools cancelled field trips, and politicians called for greater regulation of marine parks. In the face of mounting pressure, SeaWorld eventually relented. In 2016, the company announced that it would end its captive orca breeding program and phase out its theatrical orca shows. The orcas currently in their care would remain at SeaWorld for the rest of their lives, but they would no longer be forced to perform tricks for entertainment. The company pledged to focus instead on education, conservation, and rescue efforts. The decision was hailed as a victory by animal rights activists who had been campaigning against orca captivity for decades. But for many, the changes came too late. The damage to SeaWorld's reputation was already done, and the debate over the ethics of keeping orcas in captivity continues to this day. The attack on Ken Peters, the $75,000 OSHA fine, the end of waterwork, and the release of blackfish all represent key turning points in the fight against orca captivity. They are reminders of the inherent dangers of confining these magnificent creatures to artificial environments and the ethical responsibility we have to protect them. The incident forced the world to confront the dark side of marine park entertainment, to question the price of spectacle, and to reconsider our relationship with the natural world. It's a legacy written in scars, in lawsuits, and in the slow, but ultimately undeniable, shift in public consciousness. A legacy that continues to haunt SeaWorld and should continue to do so as a reminder of the cost of keeping wild animals in captivity.